What if your financial future depended on one thing? Not how well you invested, not how smart you were, not even how the market performed, but on how long the people around you stayed alive. Imagine pooling money with a group of friends. Every year, the returns get split among whoever is still alive, and as time passes, people start disappearing, not metaphorically, literally. Until one day, only one person is left, and they get everything. This wasn't a thought experiment. It wasn't fiction. It was real. Governments promoted it. Families invested in it. Entire fortunes were built and lost on it. This is the story of the Tontine, a financial system so strange, so unsettling, that it blurred the line between investing and something far darker. And the most disturbing part? Versions of this idea still exist today. To understand how something like a tontine could ever exist, you have to step back into a world that looked very different from ours. The 17th century was a time of constant war, unstable economies, and governments that were perpetually broke. Kings needed money fast. Traditional taxes weren't enough, borrowing was unreliable, and printing money often led to disaster. So they got creative. Enter Lorenzo de Tonti, an Italian banker with a radical idea. Instead of borrowing money in the traditional sense, why not create a system where citizens voluntarily pool funds and get rewarded over time? At first, it sounded almost brilliant. Participants would invest a sum of money into a shared pool. The government would invest that pool and generate returns. Each year, those returns would be distributed among the surviving members. But here's the twist. As members died, their share didn't go to their families. It was redistributed to the survivors, which meant that the fewer people left, the bigger the payouts, until eventually, one person remained, and they got everything. The first major implementation of a tontine came in France in the late 1600s. The monarchy needed funding, and traditional bonds weren't attracting enough investors. So they introduced a tontine structure as a kind of hybrid between a lottery and an annuity. At first, people were skeptical. Why would anyone agree to a system where their profits depended on others dying? But then the math kicked in. If you lived longer than average, your returns could be enormous. And suddenly, it wasn't about morality, it was about probability. Families began enrolling not just themselves, but their children. Why? Because younger participants had a higher chance of outliving others. This is where the system started to shift from a clever financial tool to something deeply unsettling. Because now people weren't just investing money, they were placing bets on human lifespans. The idea spread quickly across Europe. Governments loved it because it solved a major problem, raising money without guaranteeing repayment to heirs. Once a participant died, their obligation ended. No inheritance, no long-term liability. Investors loved it because of the upside. The longer they lived, the more they earned. It was a rare situation where both sides felt like they were winning. But underneath that illusion was a ticking time bomb, because the entire system depended on one uncomfortable truth. For someone to gain, someone else had to die. And as the years passed, strange patterns began to emerge. Participants started tracking each other's health. Communities whispered about who looked weak, who might not last the winter. In some cases, investors chose to enroll the youngest and healthiest individuals they could find, sometimes even strangers, just to increase their odds. The tontine had quietly transformed from a financial product into a social experiment, one that tested the limits of human behavior. And here's something I want you to think about. If you were alive back then, would you have invested in a tontine? Would you play the odds or walk away? Pause for a second, drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how you'd decide. And if you're into stories like this, where finance and human psychology collide, make sure you like the video. It helps more people discover these hidden chapters of history. Now, let's keep going. For a while, the system worked, but then reality caught up. Because when money is tied directly to mortality, incentives can become dangerous. There were rumors, never fully proven but persistent, of foul play. Stories circulated of participants who died under mysterious circumstances, others who were isolated or neglected as they grew older. Even without direct wrongdoing, the psychological effect was undeniable. Imagine knowing that your survival meant more money, while someone else's death did the same. It created a quiet, unspoken tension. And over time, that tension eroded trust. But the real breaking point came from something even more predictable: the math. Early investors started realizing that the system didn't always pay out as expected. If too many participants lived longer than anticipated, returns shrank. If the government mismanaged funds, payouts suffered. And worst of all, some tontines were structured so poorly that they became unsustainable. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Governments that once promoted tontines began to distance themselves from them. Scandals emerged. Mismanagement, corruption, and unrealistic projections eroded confidence. In some cases, the final survivors, those who were supposed to receive massive payouts, ended up with far less than promised. The dream had turned into disappointment, and the public began to ask uncomfortable questions. Was this ever a good idea? Or was it a system built on a fundamental flaw, that tying financial gain to human death would eventually backfire? Gradually, tontines faded from mainstream use, but they didn't disappear completely. Over time, various attempts were made to fix the tontine model. Some versions introduced safeguards, limits on payouts, better regulation, clearer terms. Others tried to remove the more disturbing elements, focusing on longevity risk sharing rather than direct competition. But the core problem remained. The structure itself created conflicting incentives, and no amount of tweaking could fully remove that tension. By the early 20th century, most countries had either banned tontines outright or heavily restricted them. They became a historical curiosity, a strange footnote in the evolution of finance. Or so it seemed. Because here's the twist. The logic behind tontines never disappeared. It just evolved. Today, we have retirement systems, annuities, and insurance products that operate on similar principles, pooling risk across large groups. The difference is that modern systems try to remove the direct link between individual death and personal gain, but the underlying math is still there. In fact, some economists have argued that tontines could make a comeback. Why? Because they solve a real problem: longevity risk, the risk of outliving your savings. As life expectancy increases, traditional pension systems are under strain. Governments are once again searching for ways to manage long-term financial obligations. And once again, the tontine model is being reconsidered. But here's where things get uncomfortable again, because if you look closely, the same patterns keep appearing. Whenever there's financial pressure, whenever traditional systems start to fail, ideas like the tontine come back, repackaged, rebranded, redesigned, but fundamentally the same. A system where risk is shared, but outcomes are uneven, where survival changes the equation, and where human behavior doesn't always follow the neat assumptions of financial models. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. 3 takeaways: what we should learn. 1. Incentives shape behavior. Always, the tontine wasn't inherently evil. It was a system, but its incentives created unintended consequences. Whenever financial gain is tied to something as fundamental as human life, behavior changes. 2. Clever financial ideas can hide dangerous trade-offs. At first glance, tontines solved a real problem, but they also introduced ethical and psychological risks that weren't obvious at first. 3. History's dead ideas rarely stay dead. The tontine disappeared, but its logic didn't, and that's what makes it worth paying attention to today. So here's the question you're left with. If a modern version of a tontine promised you financial security in retirement, would you take it? Even if, somewhere in the background, the math still depended on who lived and who didn't? Because the most dangerous ideas in finance aren't the ones that fail instantly. They're the ones that almost work. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's strangest financial systems, subscribe for more stories like this. There are countless hidden ideas, some brilliant, some disturbing, that still shape the world we live in today. And if this video made you think differently, share it with someone who'd find it just as fascinating. Because sometimes, the past explains more about the present than we realize.